In the spring of 1872, a child named Nathaniel Moore was admitted to the private research annex of a rural Pennsylvania hospital. He was not brought in for treatment. The official ledger noted him as a subject of pediatric clinical analysis. What followed in the next 2 days was recorded, archived, and then locked away under a now defunct institutional designation. None of the attending staff were formally charged. The facility no longer exists in public records. But what happened in those final 48 hours left behind technical memoranda, handwritten logs, and incomplete observations that would not resurface for over a century. The Arcadia Research Hospital presented itself as a model of post-war medical modernity. Located outside the township of Berryman, it catered to families seeking specialized diagnostic insight unavailable in major cities. Arcadia promoted a pioneering approach, experimental methods in child neurology, strictly regulated and claimed to be humane. Its literature praised its partnerships with regional universities and boasted of receiving government grants for human development monitoring. Inside, however, access was restricted by tiered clearances. Patients like Nathaniel Moore were assigned to non-public registries and classified as exceptional cases. These categories permitted deviation from conventional oversight. Incorporated in 1863 as a civilian adjunct to Union Army medical logistics, Arcadia Research Hospital was initially tasked with creating procedural models for the treatment of rare blood conditions in children. Its remote location was chosen, for reasons never publicly explained. Situated on a slope near the Susquehanna River, the property had no neighboring settlements within a 3-mile radius. Its founding board included 3 physicians and 1 accountant, all of whom had former affiliations with military administrative offices. By 1868, Arcadia had transitioned from field-tested care to a hybrid classification, research-oriented pediatrics. The facility began receiving referrals directly from educational institutions, particularly those operating under private or denominational charters. Enrollment or admission of a subject required a multi-stage application involving both parental authorization and state clerical validation. The approval process was designed to appear rigorous, yet records indicate that most applications were processed in under 1 week. No patient, once admitted under what was labeled secondary observation, was transferred to another hospital. The hospital's main building was a 3-story brick structure with unusually narrow windows and reinforced internal doors. Attached to it was an annex constructed in 1870. This new wing, called the Auxiliary Pediatric Assessment Hall, operated under a separate registry. Individuals listed under this annex were recorded not as patients, but as participants in diagnostic experimentation. These records were archived under a file-type code labeled Series E. Nathaniel Moore was one of only 4 minors known to be documented under this classification between 1871 and 1873. Public communication from Arcadia was managed by a person referred to only as Director T.F. Marston. His role in the institution's hierarchy remains unclear, though his signature appears on all external correspondence, budget justifications, and research applications filed during that period. None of the available documents identify any physician by full name. Professional credentials were indicated only by initials. Correspondence between Arcadia and outside institutions regularly omitted direct references to the identities of both staff and participants. The facility maintained an outward appearance of efficiency. Local residents, though few in number, were aware of the hospital's presence. Visiting physicians were occasionally seen entering via horse-drawn carriage, typically before dawn. They did not lodge in the town and were not known to engage in community affairs. Supply wagons contracted from vendors in Harrisburg delivered provisions on alternating Wednesdays. Receipts from these deliveries show consistent orders of laboratory alcohol, distilled water, surgical paper, and graphite ink. Orders for bedding, children's clothing, or standard household items were rare. The annex, where Nathaniel was later recorded, included a separate ledger system and was not connected to the central building via a hallway or passage. Instead, it required an external walk of 35 paces based on architectural diagrams. The layout suggests an intentional separation from the main clinical activities. The annex had reinforced flooring and observation windows placed at ceiling height. It also featured two small rooms labeled adjustment suites, both containing wall-mounted timekeeping devices that operated independently of the main hospital clock system. These suites were only used during limited intervals between 1871 and 1873. Among the community of regional hospitals, Arcadia was known but not widely discussed. Its methodologies were occasionally referenced in early neurology symposia hosted in New Haven and Baltimore. However, its name never appeared on formal attendee lists. Abstracts submitted under its banner used the institution's location as the primary identifier, not its name. Phrases such as data from Susquehanna Diagnostics and rural pediatric annex findings served as substitutes. This pattern of anonymized citation implies that Arcadia was seen as methodologically useful but institutionally ambiguous. Documents obtained from a university archive in Vermont include a series of correspondences between faculty researchers and a recipient listed only as TFM, Director of Operations, Berryman Facility. One exchange, dated November 1871, requests clarification on terminology used in one of Arcadia's submissions. The phrase in question was subject responsiveness within ultradian intervals. The reply, written in Director Marston's hand, explains that this refers to observation of non-voluntary behavioral fluctuations in cycles shorter than a day. He adds that these are particularly detectable in male minors aged 6 to 10 years with no prior systemic illness. This aligns with the profile later attached to Nathaniel Moore. Arcadia's classification protocols divided minors into several categories. Most were listed under Group P, indicating physical diagnostics. A smaller number fell under Group C, referencing cognitive assessments. Series E, where Nathaniel was entered, had no acronymic explanation and was not included in published material. Internal notes suggest that Series E involved cases deviating from standard neurodevelopmental projections despite lack of preceding pathological stimuli. In simpler terms, these were children who exhibited observable traits not matching existing medical or behavioral patterns. To be considered for Series E, candidates were evaluated by a non-public committee referred to in documents as the Interior Board. Its members were never individually named. Committee assessments consisted of a written review of preliminary observations conducted by 2 staff members over a 72-hour intake period. The summary for Nathaniel Moore's intake survives, though redacted. It includes measurements of eye dilation at fixed light intervals, reaction time during verbal cues, and a log of unprompted physical gestures. The entry concludes with the notation, incongruent interval coordination observed. Recommend Suite A placement. Suite A was one of the adjustment suites within the annex. It was used exclusively for minors placed under Series E classification. Time logs show that Nathaniel was observed for approximately 48 hours within this suite, with entries occurring in 30-minute increments. These entries were labeled by initials, likely indicating the attending staff. Each entry includes both numerical readings and brief notations, such as nonverbal motion sustained, or eye fixated on reflective panel beyond mean duration. No indications of distress or irregular health metrics were recorded. An institutional memorandum, dated 5 months prior to Nathaniel's intake, outlines new procedural adjustments for Series E. Among these was the installation of an external signaling device adjacent to the suite's entrance. The purpose of this device, shaped like a compact metal lever, was not described in operational terms. However, later inspection reports mentioned that the signaling units were tested weekly and required manual resetting. These details suggest a mechanism of internal communication specific to the adjustment suites. Photographic evidence from the period is limited. One known image exists of the annex exterior, taken in 1872 by a visiting supply contractor. The photograph, though poorly preserved, shows the east-facing wall and the narrow entry path separating the annex from the main building. 2 small panes are visible near the roofline, likely corresponding to the ceiling observation windows mentioned in the architectural plans. No individuals are visible in the photograph. Financial records for Arcadia indicate stable institutional support during this period. Payments were routed through a bank in Philadelphia under a holding account listed as the Fulton Trust Office. Disbursements to Arcadia were categorized as developmental services, juvenile diagnostics. Itemized budgets list expenditures for custom instrumentation, clock mechanisms, and intercom fabrication, but do not reference standard medical apparatus or pharmaceuticals. Payroll listings identify only 8 compensated individuals, 5 of whom are noted with clerical designations. No surnames appear. In the months following Nathaniel Moore's documentation, Arcadia continued to operate without public scrutiny. No official inquiry into its practices was recorded during the 1870s. Reports submitted to the State Medical Review Office were signed, stamped, and marked "No irregularities detected." All such reports were authored under Director Marston's authority. Their uniform structure and repetitive phrasing imply that oversight was either minimal or procedurally circumvented. Nathaniel Moore's file remained archived, untouched, until the institution formally closed operations in 1881. Internal directives from Arcadia during the spring of 1872 included revisions to observational documentation procedures specific to Series E. These changes were introduced through an internal circular marked Confidential Pediatric Analysis Enhancements. The document included guidance for minimizing subjective interpretation in written logs. Staff were instructed to restrict language to measurable responses and to avoid adjectives unless medically standardized. One example given replaced the phrase "calm expression" with "absence of muscular contraction in orbital zone." This policy shift was part of a broader recalibration in how Arcadia recorded its data. Beginning in March of that year, all new observations were entered using a uniform format referred to in documents as the C grid. The grid included pre-printed categories such as reflex latency, mirror recognition, and sequence interruption. This system was applied in full to Nathaniel Moore's entries, providing a clearer timeline of his stay, but also reducing narrative clarity. As a result, the compiled records read as a sequence of detached measurements rather than a continuous log. Although the C-grid format limits interpretation, it reveals consistency in Nathaniel's physical condition. Recorded temperatures remained within standard pediatric ranges. No mention is made of irregular respiratory behavior, appetite changes, or interruptions to sleep intervals. His recorded posture, described across 6 entries as upright without lateral drift, remained stable. One field labeled auditory reactivity to fixed tone displays fluctuating values, though no explanatory remarks accompany these changes. An anomaly appears on the second day of observation. At 11 in the morning, the recording staff member entered unexpected movement, diagonal orientation at rest. The same phrase appears in the 11:30 and 12-hour entries, then ceases. At 12:30, a different staff member logs the subject as recentered, silent, no mechanical prompt given. The meaning of this entry remains uncertain. No instruments are known to have existed in Suite A capable of enforcing positional realignment, and the phrase mechanical prompt does not appear elsewhere in the archive. The staff assigned to Series E were granted limited tenure and rotated frequently. Service logs show that no individual remained on the Series E assignment for more than 10 weeks. These rotations were justified by Arcadia as a way to reduce observational bias. However, cross-referenced payroll records show that 3 staff members assigned to Series E later resigned from the institution with no documented reason. Their names were not retained in the hospital's alumni registers, which were published annually for public relations purposes. Test reports from Arcadia were rarely shared externally. When they were, they arrived in the form of sanitized summaries submitted to review panels at regional academic institutions. One such document, filed with a college in Pennsylvania in April 1872, mentions non-reactive pediatric subjects with rhythmic interval irregularities. Though the report does not identify Nathaniel by name, the timing and terminology match the C-grid entries found in his file. The college returned no commentary on the report, and no further correspondence was archived. Several procedural memos authored by Director Marston indicate that Suite A was outfitted with an observational ceiling apparatus in February of that year. Described as a mirrored convergence device, it allowed staff to monitor posture and orientation without direct line of sight from the hallway. The reflective properties of the device were calibrated for vertical angle perception, reducing distortion when viewed from a specific standing position. Technical specifications for this apparatus were not included in medical journals and appear to have been fabricated by a local contractor under a non-disclosure agreement. Architectural floor plans of the annex reveal unusual spatial dimensions. Suite A measured 9 feet wide and 13 feet in length, smaller than standard pediatric assessment rooms at the time. Its walls were reinforced with fiberboard overlay and featured vertical grooves spaced at 6-inch intervals. The room's only window was the ceiling aperture connected to the observation device. No fixtures or furniture were indicated. A single wall-mounted panel listed in the plans as interface unit was placed at shoulder height. The panel's function was never described in detail. The annex had no internal heating system. Climate control relied on passive ventilation, with air circulated through copper ducts embedded in the eastern wall. Maintenance logs note occasional fluctuations in ambient temperature within the suite, but no corrective action was ever recorded. During Nathaniel's stay, the recorded internal temperature remained stable at 66 degrees Fahrenheit, based on thermometer readings included with each entry. Despite the lack of physical activity, the subject's temperature logs showed no decline, suggesting metabolic consistency. Communication between annex staff and the main building occurred through a system of manual signal flags. Each suite had a corresponding flag color, raised from an external pole visible from the administrative tower. Staff were trained in specific signaling protocols, allowing for message transmission without written correspondence. On the second evening of Nathaniel's observation, the flag for Suite A was raised twice in succession. The signal, according to training logs, corresponded to extended hold, non-escalation response. No follow-up entry explains the flag's use on that occasion. That same evening, entry logs show a brief discontinuity. The 6-2 entry is signed, as is the 7, but the 6:30 interval is marked pending. Later annotations show the 6:30 slot was retroactively completed with only the phrase status unchanged. This retroactive entry is written in different handwriting and uses a darker ink than the surrounding notes. No irregularities were reported in Nathaniel's physiological readings during that time. Lighting, temperature, and auditory calibration values remained within normal operating range. Hospital supply ledgers indicate that in the week of Nathaniel's admission, a custom timing device was delivered from a workshop in central Pennsylvania. The device is listed as multi-cycle synchronizer with triple chime variation. It was installed in the annex, but not assigned to a particular suite. Staff instructions advised against setting the chime manually and included a warning not to alter its internal mechanism without supervision. The purpose of the device remains unclear, though a memo from Director Marston refers to it as an alignment support tool for interval tracking. Public inquiries into Arcadia's operations during this time were infrequent. Local authorities conducted a routine facilities inspection in May 1872, 1 month after Nathaniel's recorded stay. The inspection report includes comments on the general cleanliness of the main building, functionality of sanitation facilities, and accuracy of on-site documentation. No mention is made of the annex, which suggests it was not subject to civilian oversight. This omission is consistent with similar inspections from previous years, where annexes or secondary buildings were left unexamined. While Nathaniel's case was not the first under Series E, it is the most thoroughly documented. 3 previous cases listed under the same classification show partial logs, with significant gaps in observation entries. 2 of those cases included notations referencing external assessments, though no such assessments were found in the remaining files. By contrast, Nathaniel's documentation includes a near-continuous record of values and remarks across the full 48-hour period. This suggests that by the time of his admission, Arcadia had refined its protocol for Series E and was operating under a standardized observational framework. An internal memo filed 2 weeks after the conclusion of Nathaniel's observation states, Suite A to remain unused pending recalibration. No reason is given. The suite was listed as inactive for the next 7 months, until its brief reactivation in December of that year. During the interim, all Series E assessments were rerouted to Suite B, which had previously served as a control environment for auditory studies. Technical staff logs show that during the hiatus, Suite A's internal panel was removed and later replaced with a revised model. The design specifications for the updated panel are not included in the available archive. Arcadia continued to publish occasional reports under anonymous attribution, focusing on general observations rather than subject-specific data. In January 1873, an article appeared in a medical newsletter titled Chronospatial Orientation in Non-Responsive Pediatric Subjects. Though unsigned, the article uses phrases and measurement systems identical to those in the C-grid. It makes reference to a closed-loop interval structure and a reflective orientation assistive mechanism, both of which match the terminology found in Suite A documentation. Nathaniel is not identified, but the timing aligns with his assessment period. No additional entries for Nathaniel Moore appear in any subsequent Arcadia files. His final C-grid record is time-stamped precisely at 11:30 on the morning of his second day. The entry includes no remarks beyond standard physiological readings. Following that, the file is stamped with a closure code listed as E04 concluded. No interpretation of this code has been found. All Series E subjects prior to Nathaniel were closed under the designation E03 inactive, indicating that his case may have triggered a procedural update or reclassification. The months preceding Nathaniel Moore's documented stay at Arcadia Research Hospital revealed several administrative inconsistencies that, at the time, drew no formal attention. These anomalies were embedded within internal communications, procurement records, and procedural revisions that accumulated quietly across the institution's operational calendar. Though isolated, they reflected a gradual departure from Arcadia's original designation as a diagnostic research facility. In late January 1872, a requisition order was filed requesting modifications to the annex's lighting system. The request specified a change from fixed gas lamps to adjustable spectral lenses manufactured by a supplier in Trenton. These lenses were capable of producing color variation based on temperature calibration, a feature not used in standard medical facilities. Internal justification cited visual differentiation enhancement for fine motor observations. Installation logs show the lenses were mounted in Suite A only. No documentation indicates their use in other areas of the annex or main hospital. A follow-up note from Arcadia's technical maintenance staff reported that the new lighting system required daily recalibration to maintain visual consistency. The recalibration process included adjusting a dial located behind the suite's northern panel. This adjustment had to be completed manually, and staff were instructed to verify chromatic balance using a supplied reference card. The calibration logs for the period surrounding Nathaniel's stay include 2 entries marked Discrepancy Unresolved, both filed at the beginning of his observation window. Personnel assignments during the first quarter of 1872 were marked by elevated turnover in the Annex Division. 3 new staff members were brought in under temporary appointments, each assigned for a period of 14 days. Their duties included observation logging, environmental monitoring, and documentation verification. None of these individuals were previously affiliated with Arcadia or any regional institution. Their recruitment process bypassed the standard referral chain and was instead handled by a third-party clerical service listed as the Baycliffe Arrangement Office. This contracting method had not been used by Arcadia in prior years. Correspondence regarding the arrangement was directed through Director Marston, whose signature appears on all related authorizations. No background checks or medical certifications were attached to the personnel files for these individuals. Their initials appear sporadically in the Series E logs for early 1872, including 1 entry associated with Nathaniel Moore. After their appointments concluded, none of the individuals were retained or listed in the annual institutional review. By February, administrative logs show a marked increase in restricted access documentation. A new classification tag, internal cycle control, was applied to 9 files over a period of 3 weeks. These files, though included in the archival ledger, were stored separately and referenced only by numerical codes. Among them was a file labeled 0407E, later identified as a precursor log to Nathaniel Moore's intake profile. The contents of this file were not retained in the primary archive, but a summary form included in the registrar's notes lists the following descriptors: non-diagnostic, pre-categorized, and compliance verified without prompting. No formal case or patient name was attached to file 0407E. Its existence implies that subject evaluations were sometimes conducted before official intake began. This pre-categorization process was not disclosed in Arcadia's external documentation. Its purpose may have been to pre-screen candidates for observational suitability or to filter out minors who exhibited standard physiological or behavioral development. The summary included a rare phrase not found elsewhere in the archive: interval symmetry outside regional norm. Its meaning remains undefined. Among the technical staff assigned to Suite A during this period was a junior observer identified by the initials DM. While most observation entries adhered to the required C-grid format, DM occasionally appended side notes in smaller handwriting placed between grid fields. These annotations were not included in official logs, but were preserved on the original forms. In one instance, dated March 17th at 9 a.m., DM wrote, "No cue administered. Orientation shift present, no cause observed." The accompanying grid fields list stable vitals and unremarkable motion metrics. Further notes by DM suggest a growing uncertainty regarding the suite's internal calibration. One side annotation questions whether the mirrored ceiling panel had been aligned properly following maintenance. Another entry, recorded during a late shift, refers to cyclical reversal not matching exterior chime. These remarks, while speculative, imply that staff occasionally observed inconsistencies between expected behavior patterns and environmental conditions. No actions were taken in response to these notes, and no adjustments were logged in the maintenance schedule. Outside the annex, Arcadia's main administrative wing continued to function under standard procedures. Quarterly summaries submitted to the state included brief notes on research progress, newly admitted subjects, and procedural adjustments. The first quarter report for 1872 contains a line stating that the institution has introduced supplementary suite tracking protocols for enhanced response assessment. Though written in generic terms, this likely refers to the C-grid system. No mention is made of Series E or any related classification. Minutes from the March meeting of Arcadia's Internal Review Board include a discussion labeled Annex Protocol Refinements. These minutes are unusually brief, consisting of 2 sentences. The second sentence reads, "Observational congruity remains within predicted variances." There is no indication of who authored or chaired the meeting. The document is signed only by Director Marston. Its brevity stands in contrast to earlier review board minutes, which routinely spanned multiple pages and included detailed assessments of institutional operations. Shipping manifests for the month of March indicate the arrival of 2 crates marked sensitive precision instruments. These were delivered by a private contractor operating out of Lancaster. The shipment was directed to the annex and logged under restricted inventory. Itemized contents include a pair of brass cylindrical devices labeled as non-resonant time registers, along with calibration tools and mounting brackets. No documentation explains their function. A handwritten notation on the delivery receipt states, "Positioned according to internal cycle interval." This phrasing is consistent with terminology used in several Series E documents. That same week, a procedural guideline was distributed among annex staff regarding non-invasive indicator positioning. The guideline includes a diagram of the suite's interior, indicating preferred placement zones for observational instruments. The document emphasizes maintaining distance from the wall panel interface and refraining from repositioning reflective surfaces. While the reason for this restriction is not provided, several technical logs include references to staff being cautioned after unauthorized repositioning during previous months. Nathaniel Moore's intake file includes a signed form from his admitting guardian. The signature is legible, but does not match any of the surnames listed in Moore family census records for that decade. No birth certificate or civil registry for Nathaniel Moore exists in state records from that period. The intake form identifies him as age estimated 8 to 10, physically intact, no prior hospitalization. A box marked developmental variation suspected is checked, but no elaboration is provided. The form was approved with an expedited processing stamp. It is unclear how Nathaniel was selected for observation under Series E. No documentation of preliminary referral exists, nor is there a recorded evaluation from an external medical professional. The absence of such materials suggests that the intake may have originated within Arcadia itself, bypassing traditional vetting channels. The summary attached to his intake packet includes only 3 statements: compliance observed, cycle entry noted, and subject stability confirmed. These terms are consistent with internal evaluations, but are not used in standard pediatric diagnostics. Facility logs indicate that in the week prior to Nathaniel's intake, several tests were conducted in the annex without a recorded subject. These tests, labeled simulation intervals, were designed to measure the internal timing mechanisms of Suite A without a participant present. Notes from these sessions show adjustments to wall-mounted indicators and synchronization checks involving the annex chime system. The simulation logs list expected results, but include no record of anomalies. Their purpose may have been to prepare Suite A for a scheduled intake, though no direct connection is made. Director Marston's involvement in daily operations increased during this period. Previously known to remain within the main administrative wing, he made 5 visits to the annex between February and April 1872. These visits were not recorded on the general staff schedule, but appear in corridor access logs, which tracked internal movement for security purposes. Each visit lasted between 20 and 35 minutes. No staff entries overlap with his presence during these times. The annex access point used during these visits was reserved for supervisory personnel. Despite these irregularities, Arcadia's institutional record remained intact. Its financial audits passed with no discrepancies noted. Academic correspondence continued, with universities requesting general findings and offering publication space for selected data summaries. No inquiries were made about specific cases or subjects. The invisibility of Series E operations was preserved by the compartmentalization of data and the institution's emphasis on procedural conformity. As a result, warning signs embedded in internal behavior, administrative patterns, and unexplained modifications went unacknowledged. In the weeks following Nathaniel Moore's recorded observation, the internal rhythm of Arcadia Research Hospital resumed without visible disruption. The annex remained listed as active, and maintenance logs show regular calibrations of its mechanical systems. However, subtle procedural shifts began to appear, particularly within the documentation surrounding Series E classifications. Observation logs for other subjects placed under Series E after March 1872 began to display reduced specificity. Earlier entries had adhered to the C-grid model with consistent detail, but newer files introduced abbreviated summaries and omitted fields. The sequence interruption category, a previously emphasized metric, was removed altogether. Handwriting styles also changed, with block lettering replacing cursive script in over half of the subsequent entries. These changes occurred without any formal directive in the procedural memos. At the same time, internal staff communication adopted new terminology. Where previous documents referred to cycle timing and interval measurement, later logs introduced the term convergence window. The phrase appears in 9 separate entries across 3 different subjects. It is not defined in any accompanying text, but appears in contexts previously occupied by phase observations or time response indicators. The adoption of this new language suggests a conceptual realignment in how Arcadia staff interpreted the phenomena under review. The hospital's procurement documents also reflected this shift. A supply order dated May 2, 1872, requested a series of quartz timing rods and non-reflective alignment discs. These items were not standard in medical diagnostics, but were used in precision instrument calibration for astronomical and acoustic applications. The supplier was a Philadelphia-based company that specialized in scientific components, mostly for use in collegiate observatories. No explanation for the application of these materials at Arcadia was recorded. Coinciding with the acquisition of these materials, a construction invoice listed modifications to Suite B, the secondary adjustment suite in the annex. Diagrams included in the invoice show the removal of a central floor panel and the installation of a brass perimeter fixture surrounding the ceiling observation aperture. The panel's purpose is not stated, though its placement mimics earlier drawings of Suite A's configuration. These structural changes occurred over a 2-day span and involved only 2 contracted workers, both brought in under temporary labor agreements. Further deviation from standard procedure is observed in Arcadia's archival inventory for June 1872. A set of internal circulars usually delivered weekly to staff were temporarily suspended. In their place, a single memorandum was distributed under restricted access. Titled Suite Standardization Interim Protocol, the memo outlined temporary use restrictions for Suite A. It stated that the suite was undergoing contextual calibration re-evaluation and should remain sealed unless authorized by senior staff. No timeline for reopening was provided. This memo was signed not by Director Marston, but by a subordinate administrator identified only as RCL. This individual had not appeared in prior documentation and does not appear again in future records. The absence of known administrative history raises questions about the position's legitimacy. Further investigation into payroll and correspondence logs yields no additional information about RCL, suggesting a temporary or placeholder designation. In parallel with these internal adjustments, Arcadia began receiving new correspondence from external institutions. One letter, dated June 10th, was addressed to Director Marston and referenced recent findings submitted by the hospital. The author, affiliated with a Massachusetts college, expressed interest in the interval asymmetry patterns noted in the enclosed material and requested clarification on the term response lattice fluctuation. Arcadia's response, also preserved, deflected the inquiry by stating that the findings were preliminary and not suitable for external review. The exchange concluded without resolution. Despite maintaining a standard facade, inconsistencies continued to accumulate in Arcadia's observational framework. Beginning in late May, the annex flag system was modified. The visual signal for Suite A, previously yellow with a blue corner, was replaced with a fully blue standard. No notification of the change was circulated among the main hospital staff. Flag logs from this period show an increase in double-raised signals, particularly in the evening hours. These signals, according to training protocols, indicated prolonged non-event status requiring supervisory verification. There is no record of these verifications being conducted. Meanwhile, corridor access logs show a sharp decline in entries to the annex from clinical staff. From an average of 6 daily logins in April, the number dropped to 2 per day by June. The decline coincided with the appointment of a new supervisory clerk assigned to annex intake scheduling. This clerk, referred to only as EN, issued weekly schedules that listed Suite B as primary diagnostic point. Suite A remained unlisted, though it continued to appear in equipment maintenance reports. At this point, an operational pattern had emerged. Suite A had become structurally maintained, but procedurally inactive. Its systems were recalibrated, its devices updated, and its status sealed behind administrative memos. No additional subjects were documented within its walls after Nathaniel Moore, yet the suite remained powered, supplied, and listed as an active structural unit in every quarterly review submitted to the state. Facility expenditures reflect the anomaly. Between April and July 1872, maintenance costs specific to Suite A exceeded those of the entire main ward. Itemized invoices list filter replacements, reflective surface adjustments, and precision alignment services. These services were provided by external vendors with no other contracts in Arcadia records. Several of these vendors specialized in surveying instruments and navigational gyroscope calibration, further distancing their work from typical hospital maintenance. Photographic evidence from this period is extremely limited. However, One architectural blueprint dated July 18th includes a penciled annotation stating "Mirror Anchor Revised per Stability Test." The location of the note corresponds to Suite A's sealing apparatus. Its author is not identified, and the test in question is not mentioned elsewhere in the archive. Other notations in the blueprint reference sealing, beam reinforcements and access hatch relocation, all without accompanying memos. Administrative silence continued. Annual board meeting transcripts from the summer of 1872 omit all reference to Series E or Annex activity. Previous transcripts had occasionally acknowledged auxiliary diagnostic efforts. Their absence suggests a conscious exclusion from formal discourse. Staff rosters published that autumn list no changes to the Annex team, but payroll records show reduced disbursements, implying fewer active personnel than publicly stated. Later that year, a scheduled audit by a regional health registrar was cancelled. Official correspondence cites scheduling conflicts and inclement weather. The audit was never rescheduled. Internal logs show that during the intended audit period, Arcadia staff conducted a full Annex systems review. Maintenance logs note full environmental reset, a procedure not referenced in earlier documentation. Instrument recalibrations were conducted on both Suites A and B, though only Suite B had a recorded subject during that week. Among the final documents referencing Nathaniel Moore is a handwritten summary titled E04 Comparative Interval. The page includes a series of time notations aligned to a 24-hour model. Markings are concentrated around early morning and late evening intervals, with annotations indicating repeating alignment and null drift on second cycle. These notations lack corresponding definitions, but match terminology used in non-medical fields related to mechanical pattern detection. The author is unidentified, and the summary appears to have been created after Nathaniel's case file was officially closed. No follow-up inquiry into the E04 classification appears in Arcadia's remaining records. All future cases were designated under different codes or processed through alternative classifications. The abrupt cessation of E-series designations after Nathaniel's file suggests a procedural reassessment or possibly the discontinuation of the observational model entirely. No public statement was made, and no internal justification has been recovered. The institution's final procedural update for the year, distributed in December, removed all mention of Suite A from staff training materials. The suite was listed in architectural records, but omitted from functional diagrams. Its location was labeled non-assigned space. Though never formally decommissioned, its operational footprint was effectively erased from procedural materials. This act, more than any individual anomaly, signaled a transition in Arcadia's institutional posture, a silent redirection away from the observational framework that had culminated in Nathaniel Moore's final 48-hour entry. The full archive of Arcadia Research Hospital was not publicly disclosed until 1963, nearly a century after Nathaniel Moore's observation period was recorded. The materials were discovered in a university storage basement in Massachusetts, mislabeled under agricultural development records. Among them were 3 boxes marked Susquehanna Diagnostic Cycles. Inside were forms bearing Arcadia's distinctive C-grid pattern, multiple internal memos bearing Director Marston's signature, and fragmentary floor plans of the annex. The most complete file was labeled E04 Concluded. It corresponded in full to Nathaniel's entry record. Academic custodians at the university had no record of the boxes being received. Shipping tags were intact, but bore no sender information. A brief investigation by university staff determined that the boxes had likely been donated during a 1920s archival consolidation. Due to labeling errors, they had remained undisturbed. Upon discovery, the material was assigned to the Department of Historical Methodology for review. Its contents were soon identified as being unrelated to the agricultural sciences. Initial summaries compiled by the department made note of the unique data structures. The documents were not easily categorized under medical, behavioral, or psychological frameworks. Observations used language uncommon in institutional diagnostics. Phrases such as repeating interval synchronization and anchor consistency outside external stimulus appeared frequently. Faculty members described the entries as methodical but lacking in conventional clinical grounding. This ambiguity delayed formal publication of any findings for another 5 years. One doctoral candidate began compiling a working index of terms used in the Arcadia archive. Her annotated glossary, while incomplete, became the first systematic attempt to contextualize the terminology. Through cross-referencing, she identified recurring terms in observation logs with mechanical concepts used in precision timekeeping. These included references to phase offset, cyclic repeat, and drift nullification. None were directly associated with pediatric behavior in known medical literature. The glossary also identified the consistent use of the phrase interval architecture. In at least 4 memos, the term was used in reference to Suite A's configuration. Diagrams showed measurements aligning the suite's internal features with modular timing systems. These configurations corresponded closely with mechanical standards used in industrial clock design of the late 19th century. The implications of this architectural congruence were not addressed in the original Arcadia documents. Instead, the term was applied without definition, as if its meaning were assumed among staff. A graduate symposium held in 1969 presented select findings from the Arcadia archive. One presentation focused on the observational methodology used in Suite A. The speaker noted that, unlike traditional pediatric observation rooms, Suite A's structure emphasized control over environmental rhythm rather than direct subject engagement. Environmental rhythm, in this case, referred to the manipulation of temporal cues within the physical space. This observation sparked interest in the facility's internal layout and equipment, particularly the timing devices and reflective ceiling apparatus. Independent researchers reviewing the materials noted that Arcadia's use of observation suites with self-contained timing mechanisms bore similarities to early 20th century experiments in human environmental entrainment. However, Arcadia's files predated these experiments by several decades. The presence of controlled interval environments designed specifically for pediatric subjects was considered anomalous. The suite's interior, devoid of traditional furnishings, aligned more closely with calibration chambers than clinical wards. A request was filed to access state archives for building permits and institutional charters related to Arcadia. The request returned limited results. Arcadia's original charter listed it as a civilian support facility for advanced developmental health tracking. Its designation allowed for experimental methodology under federal medical guidelines active during the Reconstruction period. However, addendums to the charter were filed between 1871 and 1873 that were not included in the state's microfilm records. These missing filings correspond exactly with the period during which Series E classifications were used. Further complicating efforts to reconstruct Arcadia's operational scope was the absence of staff identities. Aside from Director Marston's initials, no full names appeared in the observational or administrative logs. Payroll records were routed through intermediary holding offices, primarily the Fulton Trust Office, whose own ledgers were never recovered. Personnel signatures on observational forms were coded and used interchangeably. The only identifiers were handwritten initials, often without matching correspondence in other institutional documents. A researcher investigating the Moore file observed a procedural deviation in the final pages. The last 3 C-grid entries, all time-stamped within the final 6 hours of Nathaniel's observation, included a new column labeled Alignment Return Latency. This metric had not appeared in prior entries for any subject. Its numerical values fluctuated every 30 minutes, and the final value recorded at 11:30 showed a sudden stabilization. This point was marked with a closure code, E04 concluded. The same code did not appear in any other Series E file. In reviewing structural plans, researchers noted that the suite's reflective ceiling panel was mounted at a precise angle calibrated to solar entry points during specific morning intervals. The angle of incidence matched the trajectory of natural light filtered through the annex's limited window access. This alignment was preserved even after the annex's apparent disuse. It suggests that natural light exposure may have played a role in observational methodology. No documents describe this alignment's purpose. During the second phase of the archival review, a cross-reference was made between Arcadia's internal terminology and a set of unpublished physics research papers from the same era. One term, interval coherence, appeared in both collections. In the physics papers, it referred to the maintenance of synchronized oscillation among mechanical regulators. In the Arcadia documents, the same term was used in reference to subject behavioral patterns. The similarity in language, while potentially coincidental, indicated a conceptual overlap between Arcadia's observational goals and the mechanics of controlled timing systems. Despite this emerging framework, the intention behind Nathaniel Moore's 48-hour observation remained unclear. His file contained no hypotheses, no projections, and no listed purpose. The documentation was rigorous but devoid of interpretive commentary. Internal memos referenced his case only as a final calibration subject, a term found nowhere else in the archive. The phrase suggests that his intake may have served a concluding role in a particular procedural sequence. No explanation of that sequence was included. When the archive was presented to a broader academic audience in the 1970s, response was divided. Some viewed the materials as an experimental failure, whose records survived only by accident. Others believed Arcadia had pioneered methodologies that were never adopted due to institutional secrecy or obsolescence. A third interpretation suggested that the lack of clarity was intentional, designed to compartmentalize knowledge within specific operational hierarchies. Under this model, even staff executing the protocols may not have known their full purpose. That same decade, a historian specializing in obscure institutional frameworks compiled a monograph titled Diagnostics Without Outcome, a study of closed-loop research facilities. One chapter was dedicated to Arcadia. It included analysis of the reflective geometry in Suite A, the consistency of subject posture data, and the unexplained presence of non-medical equipment within pediatric observation environments. The chapter concluded with an assertion that Arcadia had constructed a system not to analyze subjects, but to test the responsiveness of environmental design against human consistency. Nathaniel Moore's role under this interpretation was to serve as a metric of temporal conformity. While this hypothesis could not be confirmed, the cumulative record suggests that Arcadia's intention was less about intervention and more about measurement. The use of controlled light entry, rhythmically adjusted internal chimes, and cyclic observation fields imply an interest in establishing or tracking patterns beyond traditional medical concern. Nathaniel's observation period, precisely timed and terminated with no post-entry follow-up, fits this structure. The broader implications of the Arcadia archive remain unresolved. Most of the facility's physical site was demolished in the early 1900s, with no known artifacts recovered. Its annex, according to land surveys, was located in an area now used for residential development. No surface remnants of the building remain. All attempts to locate original equipment, signage, or personal correspondence related to the facility have failed. Today, Nathaniel Moore's record stands as the most complete example of Arcadia's Series E framework. It offers a continuous, if opaque, view into a methodology that eludes modern classification. The lack of conclusion in his documentation, combined with the absence of conventional medical rationale, leaves only structure, pattern, and silence. These elements, preserved unintentionally, are all that remain to define the 48 hours that were meticulously recorded but never explained. By the early 1980s, the Arcadia archive had entered academic circulation in limited form. Photocopies of select files were held by a small number of university libraries, mostly in northeastern states. Researchers attempting to reconstruct the sequence of events surrounding Series E observations encountered one recurring obstacle: the uniformity of data without any interpretive layer. No conclusions, internal or external, were ever documented. The absence of analysis suggested that the observation itself may have been the sole objective. This conclusion was supported by a set of technical papers produced in 1983 by a consortium of behavioral researchers who had reviewed the C-grid logs. Their report, titled Non-Interventional Frameworks in Pre-Standardized Institutional Settings, noted that Arcadia's protocol had eliminated every variable except environmental timing. Even subject movement was passively tracked, never altered or redirected. The researchers hypothesized that the facility was exploring whether temporal environments could produce consistent behavioral anchors in pediatric subjects without external prompts. In parallel with academic efforts, a group of archival volunteers began indexing the procedural memos found among the Arcadia materials. Over several months, they produced a chronological map of the Annex's operational directives from 1870 to 1873. The map revealed a systematic pattern of adjustments to Suite A's internal mechanisms, each aligned to seasonal solar changes and corresponding calibration entries. These adjustments occurred even during periods with no recorded subjects, indicating that the space itself was being maintained independently of usage. An unpublished letter from a retired hospital administrator in Pennsylvania, dated 1985, was later added to the university's collection. The letter referenced Arcadia indirectly, describing a rural facility used for cycle-based pediatric monitoring in the post-war period. The author claimed to have encountered former Arcadia staff in the 1910s, who referred to the facility as a chamber for confirming pattern drift. The term appeared unfamiliar to archivists, but was noted in annotations as potentially linked to interval tracking terminology used in mechanical engineering. In the following years, interest in the Arcadia material waned. The lack of overt narrative, combined with its procedural repetition, made it unsuitable for general publication. However, individual researchers continued to explore aspects of its design. A 1987 engineering paper included an appendix comparing Suite A's reflected light geometry with certain solar tracking observatories used in early naval instrumentation. The similarities in calibration angles and material reflectivity were noted, but no direct historical connection was established. The same year, an inquiry was made into the remaining land records of Berryman Township, where Arcadia had been located. Property ownership had shifted multiple times following the institution's closure in 1881. The annex structure was removed, and later development included a farmhouse built in 1903. No building materials matching Arcadia's original specifications were found in the county's construction permits. However, one early map displayed a rectangular foundation marked Annex Structure Out of Service. Its dimensions matched those listed in Arcadia's internal architectural diagrams. Back at the university, digitization of the Arcadia archive began in 1992. Optical scans of the observation logs revealed several anomalies in ink density and pressure patterns. These variations suggested that different writing instruments were used within the same shift logs, despite being signed by a single set of initials. A forensic handwriting review conducted by a graduate team proposed that multiple staff may have contributed to single entries under a shared designation. The reason for this practice remains speculative, though it would have simplified reporting within a restricted access environment. Among the scanned materials, a fragmentary diagram was discovered that had not been catalogued in earlier inventories. The sheet was unmarked except for faint measurement notations and a heading, Suite Vector Alignment Plan. The diagram showed a circular path overlaid on a square room, with points marked at regular intervals around the perimeter. A central dot was connected by thin lines to each point, forming a radial pattern. Though the document contained no text explanation, its geometry resembled mapping models used in harmonic oscillation studies from the late 1800s. This discovery led to renewed interest in Arcadia's internal terminology. The term alignment return latency, unique to Nathaniel Moore's final entries, was reconsidered in light of the vector alignment diagram. Researchers proposed that this metric may have measured the time required for a subject's orientation or behavior to return to a predefined position following a passive environmental shift. If accurate, this would imply that Suite A was designed not only for observation, but for the controlled delivery of temporal or spatial variation stimuli. Further supporting this interpretation was a set of undated maintenance instructions referencing a device called a repeating alignment anchor. Described only in brief terms, the device required manual tension calibration and was installed behind the suite's northern wall panel. No visual record of the apparatus survives, but one entry noted the use of a tension balance marked in half-second increments. Devices with such calibration requirements are more commonly found in time-regulated machinery than in medical equipment. Despite these technical findings, the question of intent remained unanswered. Arcadia's documentation lacked any interpretive summaries, institutional reports, or evidence of peer review. Communications with external entities were limited to general data sets and procedural abstracts. No policy documents explained the rationale for Series E, and no post-observation follow-up existed for any of the documented subjects. In the case of Nathaniel Moore, his final recorded metric appeared to signal the end of a measurement, but not a conclusion. In 1995, an interdisciplinary working group formed to analyze Arcadia's operational model. Consisting of medical historians, architects, and mechanical engineers, the group met for 6 months. Their final report suggested that Arcadia functioned as a closed observational system in which the subject's primary role was to serve as a feedback element in a larger temporal architecture. Under this framework, Suite A was not merely a diagnostic space, but a controlled environment in which timing, light, and spatial orientation were manipulated with high precision to observe consistency in minor physiological variables. The report emphasized that while no direct outcomes were stated, the implications pointed toward a design that attempted to treat behavioral regularity as a measurable function of environment. The subject's role was neither therapeutic nor developmental, but instead instrumental, a necessary component in verifying the internal consistency of the constructed system. In this view, Nathaniel Moore's role was not that of a patient, but of an observable reference point. By the early 2000s, access to the Arcadia archive was limited to credentialed researchers. Public-facing material was reduced to summary indexes and anonymized diagrams. This restriction followed a growing concern that the institution's procedures, though non-invasive, had bypassed conventional oversight. As review boards retroactively assessed 19th-century methodologies, Arcadia was frequently cited as an example of operations conducted outside ethical frameworks later established in the 20th century. No direct descendants or familial connections to Nathaniel Moore have ever been identified. His intake form remains the only document linking him to the institution, and its details are incomplete. The signature on the consent line does not match known records. Without birth certification or census confirmation, his existence is preserved solely through his 48-hour documentation. That file, while intact, contains no explanation for his selection, no evaluative commentary, and no indication of outcome beyond a procedural closure code. The absence of medical terminology within his record reinforces the notion that Arcadia's objectives were not grounded in care or intervention. Each data point collected was measured against internal calibration rather than biological normativity. In this context, the boy described in the archive was not a case to be understood, improved, or resolved. He was a variable in a system calibrated to detect rhythm, orientation, and deviation. The system functioned without public accountability, operated for a defined period, and then withdrew itself from institutional memory. Today, the archive exists as a digitized dataset stored across multiple academic servers. Physical documents are preserved in controlled environments, but few researchers access them. The language used within remains inconsistent with contemporary medical or behavioral science. As such, no academic consensus has formed. Nathaniel Moore's file continues to draw interest not for what it reveals, but for how meticulously it avoids revealing anything beyond pattern, structure, and interval. The Arcadia Research Hospital formally ceased operations in 1881, recorded in a closure statement submitted to the Pennsylvania Office of Institutional Services. The document cited reallocation of diagnostic resources and completion of developmental programs. No financial insolvency was noted. The grounds were returned to county ownership the following year and subsequently leased for agricultural use. No assets were itemized, and no inventories of internal equipment were submitted. The annex was not mentioned in the closure statement. By 1882, the main structure had been partially dismantled. County records show that bricks from the building's southern wall were salvaged and reused in the construction of a post office in the nearby town of Eldridge. The annex, which stood detached from the main facility, does not appear in the deconstruction permits. Satellite sketches of the property created in the 1890s depict a leveled terrain with no standing structures. However, field notes from a county surveyor in 1894 mention the presence of a rectangular stone base set into the ground with unusual precision. No follow-up examination was recorded. No staff from Arcadia were known to have transferred to other medical institutions in the region. Alumni records from affiliated universities do not list Arcadia employment in faculty histories. The institution's absence from professional registers appears to have been deliberate. Personal correspondence between university administrators and former Arcadia contacts typically refers to the facility in vague terms, avoiding its name and location. Phrases like "that prior facility" or "the regional diagnostic annex" are used instead. Following Arcadia's closure, state oversight agencies did not pursue a review of its operations. The institution had never been formally accredited by a medical board, having operated under provisional research charters granted during the post-war Reconstruction period. These charters permitted broad methodological discretion. With no complaints filed and no injuries reported, Arcadia remained absent from regulatory audits. Its observational practices, even those classified under Series E, left no procedural violations on record. Into the early 20th century, Arcadia was occasionally referenced in specialized symposia on historical diagnostic models. These mentions were brief and lacked detail. Most referred to its use of non-intrusive cycle mapping or modular temporal feedback studies. None cited specific cases or named subjects. Academic literature avoided in-depth examination, often noting the loss or inaccessibility of records. Even when the archive was discovered decades later, the surrounding context remained incomplete. Efforts to trace any institutional legacy found minimal results. No publications emerged bearing Arcadia's imprint. Patents associated with timing instruments used in the annex were registered under unaffiliated manufacturers. The workshop in Trenton that produced Arcadia's spectral lenses closed in 1885 without passing on its fabrication methods. Its final ledger, held by the city's industrial board, lists the hospital as its largest client during the early 1870s. No explanation is provided for the termination of the contract. Contemporary historians who examined the Arcadia materials observed an intentional narrowing of scope. The facility's later years were marked by procedural minimalism and a consolidation of purpose. This trend was visible in the evolution of the observation logs, which reduced subjective input and emphasized calibrated intervals. Personnel assignments were shortened. Equipment maintenance cycles grew more frequent and isolated. The shift was systematic and its effects visible in the rhythm of documentation. Nathaniel Moore's intake file, though more complete than others, was not followed by any form of institutional reflection. No analytical commentary was included in the final entry. His documentation ceased with a timestamp and a procedural code. The facility produced no summary, no report, and no external communication regarding the case. The absence of conclusion is consistent with the institution's final phase of operation, in which data was recorded without dissemination. The only surviving reference to Nathaniel after Arcadia's closure appears in a handwritten note from an unidentified source. The note, preserved among miscellaneous materials in the university archive, includes a line that reads, "Last subject sustained full alignment until closure." The paper is undated and unsigned. No handwriting match has been identified. Its origin remains unknown, and it bears no official markings. The phrase "sustained full alignment" has no counterpart in any procedural manual or technical memo from Arcadia. Throughout the decades, the story of Arcadia was sustained only through fragmented documentation and indirect references. It did not pass into local folklore or regional memory. The hospital's presence was not recorded in town histories or commemorated in civic registers. A search of county newspaper archives from the 1870s reveals only 3 mentions, all limited to supply notices and transport schedules. None describe its function, staff, or the existence of its annex. The facility's architectural absence has also contributed to its obscurity. With no visible ruins, no signage, and no photographic evidence beyond one partial exterior image, Arcadia left behind no public artifact. Its disappearance was not marked by demolition, but by procedural vacancy. The structure was omitted from mapping updates and erased through administrative non-reference. In this absence, its operations were protected from retrospective scrutiny. As institutions modernized and integrated oversight structures, facilities like Arcadia faded from the operational memory of the medical field. The facility's timing-focused design and limited interaction model had no successors. Its methods were not duplicated, cited, or challenged. Later developments in child psychology and neurology diverged entirely from Arcadia's premise. This discontinuity left its practices isolated in the historical record. Modern reviews of the facility have encountered recurring limitations. The language used in Arcadia's documentation often lacked precise correlation with contemporary terminology. This linguistic ambiguity created interpretive difficulties. Researchers found that many of the facility's terms were context-specific, defined implicitly through usage. Without procedural manuals or internal training materials, definitions remained speculative. This isolation further removed Arcadia from the institutional frameworks that followed. Archival efforts to reclassify the facility under existing historical categories were unsuccessful. Arcadia did not meet the criteria for therapeutic institutions, research hospitals, or residential care facilities. Its structure, administrative model, and observational design placed it outside known classifications. It operated without published objectives, processed subjects without therapeutic intent, and recorded data without interpretive follow-up. These characteristics made it an anomaly even among non-standard historical institutions. Among the few recurring themes in academic reviews is the suggestion that Arcadia's purpose was self-contained. The design of Suite A, the configuration of the annex, and the controlled observation methods all point toward an institutional model that measured its own performance against internally generated patterns. The subject was not the focus, but a necessary element within an enclosed system. The institution measured environment, not behavior. It tracked cycle, not progress. Within this framework, Nathaniel Moore's record stands not as a case study, but as an interval conclusion. His presence marked the final operational coherence of the observational sequence. The documentation ceased because the pattern had reached a form of structural completion. Without public explanation or institutional acknowledgement, Arcadia's procedures concluded without event. Today, Nathaniel's file is housed in a climate-controlled drawer labeled E04 Arcadia, 1872. It includes scanned logs, calibration summaries, and environmental control records. No personal effects were archived. His intake form remains unverified. No other documentation of his life exists outside that folder. Every entry is written in neutral terms, and no narrative interpretation was ever added. Among the final recorded activities of Arcadia Research Hospital was the relocation of select documentation to off-site storage. A transport manifest dated December 1880 details the movement of archival boxes labeled by code only, with no corresponding file index. The destination listed was a university storage annex in Massachusetts, though no confirmation of receipt was filed. These materials were later rediscovered in the 1960s, forming the basis of the current archive. The absence of a transfer order, recipient acknowledgement, or shipping invoice suggests the relocation was conducted without administrative oversight. The choice of storage facility remains unexplained. The university in question had no documented affiliation with Arcadia. Its own records do not mention any medical research collaboration during the relevant period. Analysis of regional freight routes from the 1880s shows that such a shipment would have required multiple rail transfers and extended handling. The logistical effort suggests intentional preservation, though no record of authorizing personnel exists. The sealed condition of the boxes, when opened nearly a century later, indicated stable preservation. Paper oxidation was minimal. Ink remained legible. Documents had been packed with precision, separated by subject classification and sequenced by date. No explanatory materials were included. There were no cover letters, procedural manuals, or orientation notes. The archive presented itself as self-contained, requiring contextual interpretation without institutional guidance. Following its discovery, the archive was reviewed by multiple departments before being assigned to historical methodology researchers. Their assessment emphasized the consistent use of structured observation language and precise interval tracking. This consistency, uninterrupted across hundreds of entries, implied an institutional routine unaffected by subject variance. Data collection had remained stable, regardless of intake profile. Terminology was preserved even in the absence of outcome measurement. Digitization protocols adopted in the 1990s aimed to preserve formatting fidelity. Optical character recognition systems were adjusted to accommodate the irregular spacing and margin notes typical of Arcadia's forms. Scans revealed the presence of micro-notches along the bottom edge of several documents, suggesting they had once been bound or indexed within a larger system. No binder or reference frame was recovered. The notches were consistent in spacing and placement, indicating standardized filing procedures now lost. Parallel to these technical efforts, attempts were made to trace any mention of Arcadia in regional administrative archives. Property deeds, tax filings, and institutional grants were reviewed. Most references were general and non-descriptive. A handful of annual property tax statements list the facility as research holding non-public diagnostics. These entries contained no breakdown of personnel, operations, or purpose. Tax payments were routed through intermediary offices and marked as received without inspection. A review of medical literature from the 1870s revealed occasional references to pediatric cycle assessment, though none named Arcadia directly. The phrasing used in these references matched internal Arcadia terminology. Abstracts submitted to academic periodicals occasionally cited closed-cycle juvenile evaluation and controlled interval diagnostics in minors. These submissions were unattributed. Their stylistic and structural similarities suggest they originated from Arcadia staff operating under anonymity. A remaining anomaly lies in the absence of subject discharge records. Arcadia maintained intake files with signed consent, environmental metrics, and closure codes, but no entries indicating subject transfer, referral, or release. Each file concluded with a procedural designation, but omitted any narrative transition. This uniform closure procedure was applied regardless of intake profile. The pattern suggests that discharge, in a conventional sense, was not an operational priority. In discussions with archivists during the early 2000s, questions arose regarding the ethical standing of Arcadia's methods. The lack of medical oversight, non-standard terminology, and absence of subject follow-up prompted formal inquiries into historical compliance. Legal reviews determined that the facility had operated within the regulatory latitude of its charter. While its practices would not meet modern standards, they had not violated statutes active during its operational period. One archivist, while processing a shipment of unrelated historical documents, discovered a detached page bearing a watermark consistent with Arcadia's internal forms. The page, dated 1872, included a hand-drawn timing grid and the phrase, "Cycle E control set reset to 0." The remainder of the page was blank. Its presence among unrelated materials suggests that portions of the Arcadia system extended beyond its primary site or were redistributed following closure. No additional pages of this type were found. In reviewing the annex layout diagrams, one researcher observed an unused section labeled only as V-space. The section had no associated key, measurements, or descriptive notes. Located adjacent to Suite A, but unconnected by doorway or corridor, it was represented as a closed rectangle with no access points. Its inclusion on the diagram raises questions about its function. No documentation refers to this section by name, and it does not appear in maintenance logs or architectural revisions. Subsequent infrared analysis of the diagram page revealed underlying pencil marks erased prior to final submission. These marks traced the outline of the V space and included shorthand notations resembling early electrical symbols. Given the era, the presence of such symbols is unusual. Arcadia's documented equipment was mechanical and reflective, with no mention of electrical systems. The diagram remains unclassified and was not included in the final public release of archive materials. Over time, interest in Arcadia's methodology has diminished. Its terminological opacity, lack of outcome data, and closed procedural loop offer little to contemporary researchers seeking replicable models. Nevertheless, the case of Nathaniel Moore continues to appear in niche academic discussions. His documentation, complete and uninterrupted across a 48-hour period, serves as the most coherent representation of Arcadia's protocol in full operation. No other subject file offers equivalent detail. Digital access logs maintained by the university indicate that Nathaniel's file is viewed more often than any other document in the Arcadia collection. Most access originates from academic domains, though a growing percentage of inquiries come from unaffiliated users. Requests for physical access to the file are occasionally granted under controlled supervision. No annotations are permitted, and materials must be handled with preservation gloves. The file itself includes 97 separate entries, each precisely time-stamped and conforming to the C-grid format. Environmental readings remain stable throughout. Posture data does not vary. The final entry includes the code E04 concluded. No page follows. The absence of commentary, intervention, or deviation supports the prevailing interpretation that the file was not designed to inform, only to log. In response to public interest, the university issued a brief statement in 2011 acknowledging the archive's existence and availability. The statement did not provide interpretation or historical summary. It offered no position on Arcadia's purpose or ethical standing. Its final line read, "These materials are preserved as a record of an institutional framework that no longer exists." The absence of interpretation has become a defining feature of the archive. Every attempt to impose narrative, justification, or context has been met with missing data, unanswered questions, and structural dead ends. As a result, the record remains fixed in form and undefined in meaning. Nathaniel Moore's documentation, while complete in its procedural sequence, offers no clarity beyond the repetition of measurement and the silence that followed. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching, and subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering. This story was taken from documents that were found. All names have been edited to protect the source.